Representative Bloom is the representative for the 199th District, which includes Cumberland County, the Carlisle area. It's great to have him on the panel. Up next, we have Representative Frank Ryan. Frank has the kind of resume that he is drastically overqualified to be a member of the Pennsylvania State House of Representatives. He's a CPA, he is a Marine. I mean, just an incredible background. If you want to check out all the details, it's in the book here. And last but certainly not least, Senator John Eichelberger. And Senator Eichelberger is the Pennsylvania State Senator who actually I first got to know and interacted with in the wake of the midnight pay raise. So it's really nice to be sitting up here on stage with him. So I'm going to start. I want to talk about the State Constitutional Convention. Legislation has been introduced in the State House and the State Senate. The prime sponsor is Representative Bloom in the House, Senator Eichelberger in the Senate, and Representative Ryan. For those of you who don't know, we will be losing both Representative Bloom and Senator Eichelberger after this term. Both of them, because of the judiciary, got thrown into the same congressional district, but so we'll see what happens there. So first off, when was Pennsylvania's last constitutional convention?
1968, 50 years ago this year.
And prior to 1968, was this something that Pennsylvania had done before?
We've had regular constitutional conventions in Pennsylvania. The last one was in the 1880s, so 50 years isn't the longest period we've ever gone without a convention. But we have never gone for this long in Pennsylvania without the legislature passing legislation to ask the voters if they wanted to have a convention. So the last time in that 80-some-year period, 6 times the voters were asked if they wanted to have a convention.
Okay. So one of the questions, this is actually an issue that we're really focused on at Citizens Alliance of Pennsylvania. One of the things that I had a personal concern about was we hear about the boogeyman of the runaway convention. Representative Bloom, could you talk a little bit about how that is legislated out of?
Sure. The bills that both Senator Eichelberger and I have introduced include very strict limitations on which sections of the PA Constitution would actually be subject to the convention. So the actual legal authority for the convention, if in fact this is passed and the voters approve it, if it goes forward, the legal authority for the convention is strictly dealing with the provisions that we've already identified. We don't touch anything in Article 1, the Declaration of Rights section. None of that is even in this convention. It's all about the items in Article 2 and further articles that address the legislature itself, the judicial branch, the structure of the budgeting process, the procurement process, things that we do need to fix without any threat whatsoever to have anyone at this convention even having the authority to touch the Declaration of Rights, where those key civil liberties lie that we absolutely want to protect and don't even want to possibly put any opportunity for there to be any change with regard to those key things.
Okay. I'm going to jump over to the Convention of States and Article 5 Convention because there's similar concern about the idea of a runaway convention there as well. Steve, can you talk a little bit about the process for the Article 5 Convention?
Sure. So in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, the process for amending the Constitution is laid out. And it's really a 2-step process. The amendments have to be formally proposed, and then the states would be in charge of or be responsible for ratifying any amendments that get proposed. There's 2 ways for amendments to get proposed. One is by a 2/3 vote of both chambers of Congress. All 27 amendments that we currently have to the Constitution came down that path, but there's a second way for an amendment to be proposed, and that is by a convention that would be called by Congress, a convention of the states. The way that process works is at least 34 states would need to petition Congress for a convention for a specific topic or topics. And once 34 states have done that, Congress aggregates the applications and counts them. Once you get to 34, Congress is obligated to call the convention. The states would send delegations to the convention, meet in convention, discuss and debate amendments that are germane to the application, and by a one state, one vote, simple majority, an amendment can be proposed in that convention. Then it would go back down the ratification process, no changes in terms of ratification.
So in terms of the ratification process for the Constitution at the federal level, we would be looking at a amendment being proposed at the convention.
Correct.
It would then, where would it go from there?
From there, it would go to Congress. Congress, if you read Article 5, has the responsibility to specify the mode of ratification. And also in the U.S. Constitution, there are two ways for an amendment to be ratified. One is by a vote of the state legislatures. It takes 3/4 of the states, or 38 state legislatures, both chambers, voting to approve an amendment or to ratify an amendment for it to become part of the Constitution. The other way for an amendment to be ratified is actually by a vote of state ratification conventions. We've only done that once in the history of the Republic, and that was for the amendment that repealed prohibition. The way that would work is the state legislature would select or establish a process for selecting or voting on delegates to a convention, and each of the 50 states would hold a convention. The conventions would vote up or down on the amendment, and again, it would take 38 state conventions to vote to ratify for the amendment to become law.
Okay. I guess I want to talk to Representative Ryan here just for a minute, because you're going to be taking over this project for Representative Bloom. We haven't found anybody in the Senate yet to take over the project, so if any senators are out there who are interested in filling Senator Eichelberger's shoes, we could certainly use your help. Frank, what do you see, what's the merit to this approach versus other approaches?
Initially, when I was elected to office, which was about a year and a half ago, I became increasingly concerned that the Commonwealth could not withstand a potential bankruptcy. Our financial problems were so severe that if we didn't deal with them immediately, we were going to have problems. I felt the same way at the federal level, but as a state legislator, I thought I should work on those things that are important. Both Steve and Senator Eichelberger approached me about this issue, and Leo did as well a little while ago, when I became concerned that with a group of activist judges and a process of embedded regulatory morass and tie-ups, for lack of a better term, in the Commonwealth, that we would not be able to structurally fix the Commonwealth without having a constitutional convention that's limited. I had the same concerns. I frequently bring my Marine Corps cap with me because I belong to one of the largest gun clubs in the world, the United States Marine Corps. And so protecting those rights and the rights enumerated in the first article in the Pennsylvania Constitution and the Bill of Rights made sense. And both Senator Eichelberger and Steve Bloom convinced me that this made sense. I did my own research. But I'm going to tell you this, and I need everybody to hear this. After being in the Commonwealth in the House of Representatives for 12 months, I can assure you that the financial solutions to solving the Commonwealth's problems with an activist court are not sustainable. And the unfunded health care liability, plus the cost of current workers, and on top of that, about $200 billion of unfunded infrastructure. Time is not on our side, and this is the only way to do it. If you piecemeal constitutional fixes, you will find that you will weaken one leg of the government while the other leg of the government gets stronger. And so in my mind, this is the only way. And I still believe with this, if this gets approved and we get it done, that we can save the Commonwealth. For anyone here who might be a teacher, let me put this in perspective. You will be told by everyone that the contracts for your pensions cannot be altered. And mark my words, that is absolutely false if there goes into a federal bankruptcy court in which they can restructure and redo anyone. Ask the teachers in Puerto Rico what's going on right now. We need to all band together and say this is not sustainable. That's why I joined the board.
Thank you.
Leo, can I add a little
Yeah,
example
please
on
do.
that? Because I was pondered a lot myself as to, why do we need this approach? And if you think about reforming Pennsylvania government in a serious manner, one thing I've learned in the 7.5 years that I've been privileged to serve in the legislature is that it's clear that the institution is utterly incapable of reforming itself. And I want to just give a quick example of that. There's a bill that our colleague in the House, Representative Knowles, introduced 3 years ago to bring about a reduction in the size of the state house. Now, Pennsylvania has the second largest legislature and the second most expensive legislature in the whole nation, as folks know. And I think it's pretty clear that we don't necessarily have, because of having such a big, expensive legislature, I've seen no evidence to indicate that we have better laws than all the other states. And so the idea of reducing the number of legislators is something that's a lot of reformers have really been pushing, and I think rightfully so. Representative Knowles introduced his constitutional convention or constitutional amendment resolution last legislative session, and it passed with flying colors in both chambers. Everyone was touting it in their press releases and getting all this great media coverage for having voted to shrink the size of the legislature, finally. Now it's a constitutional amendment process, so it has to go through twice, 2 consecutive legislative sessions, and then it would go to the public to finally vote up or down on whether the Constitution gets changed. Well, this cycle, this year, of course, he introduced it again, brought it up, and all of a sudden the tone changed because now it was no longer just for show. Now, if it got voted through both houses, it would actually go to the people, and our numbers would get cut. And shockingly, while the bill passed, or the resolution passed by a vote of 70% to 30% in the House 2 years ago when it came up live a couple of months ago, this time, one of the representatives brought up an amendment which would throw the whole process off track, and that amendment passed by a 60% to 40% vote. The same legislators who the year before had all voted they wanted to shrink their own size, then blew it up basically and throw off the whole process, and now it has to start all over again. And you can see that just a typical example of the legislative ineptitude when it comes to fixing its own problems.
Well, one of the things, because Steve's got a great point on that, one of the things that I would tell you that I'm a big fan of reducing the size of government completely. I'm a CPA. I specialize in keeping organizations out of bankruptcy. Small business owner, have done it for 40 years. My concern, and I originally was 100% in favor of reducing the legislature, until I saw that same ineptitude throughout the process. And what I became concerned about is that we need to get behind Senator Eichelberger and Representative Bloom's bill so that we have a holistic approach. Because I'm certain that if we put it out to everybody's vote, that we would be able to get a reduction in the legislature. But then what's happened is, vis-a-vis the next bargaining chip, the House of Representatives just gave up its bargaining chip for nothing. So if we're in a constitutional convention, what do you give up then? So what I would just suggest everybody to consider, you really want to cut the cost of legislature, which we do it myself and a lot of panelists up here have done, repudiate the pension. And when you repudiate the pension, that's a fairly significant number. The cost of this government, a good friend of mine, Rod Miller, is here. We wanted to get him in the Marine Corps, but he chose the Navy instead, but we'll forgive him. Thank you, step for 5. And so, but Rod and I have had this discussion across the board that get the cost of government down, go after the cost drivers. What I love about the bills that both have introduced is that if we put our full weight behind it, we get a holistic approach to fixing the government. And it's actually the process that convinced me, as an example, it's a very worthy amendment to get this, reduce the size of the legislature into the 150s number. But once you've done that, we then have to start dealing with the fact that we've got a Supreme Court, the vast majority of members who live in one side of the state, as opposed to being an equal representation throughout the Commonwealth. We have so many structural problems in this Commonwealth that if we don't do it together, we're going to have the whim of a process. So this year might be the reducing the legislature. 8 years from now, it might be restructuring the Supreme Court. I have to tell you this, we don't have that kind of time. the solutions to the Commonwealth's financial problems. I've done bankruptcy work for my entire life. There is such a crisis that if we don't address it in the next 2 to 4 years, the solutions are so politically unpalatable that no one in this room would be tolerating it. But we need to have every person in this room to get active, start arguing this case with us, and become the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines of getting the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania restructured and send a message out nationally that we intend to fix this, because it needs to be fixed. And I support the bill completely, but a dear friend of mine, Representative Chris Dush, had an entirely different perspective on it about let's do a holistic approach, which is what I think Representative Bloom and Senator Eichelberger's bill does.
Senator Eichelberger, could you talk a little bit about what the process, like the adoption process, like how everything would play out?
This bill is very comprehensive, as we've been discussing, and it would look at Articles 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's the legislature, the legislation, the executive branch, and the judiciary, and nothing else. So it's limited in that respect. So all the questions that we hear about all the time.
Absolutely.
Size of the legislature, how much we're paid, full-time, part-time, should we have a lieutenant governor, our judicial issues that we're having. Should we be able to have, what's the governor's role when we don't have a budget in place? What kind of money can that person spend? All those things that we hear about all the time, they can all be answered in this constitutional convention. So to Frank's point, that's the way to do it. Instead of piecemealing, one thing here, 6, 8 years from now, maybe another issue, and so on, we're not going to be able to survive on that kind of time frame. So we've got to do this. This would be the way the Constitution is currently set up. We're not designing this in the bill. The process is already prescribed in our Constitution today. There would be 3 citizen delegates elected in every Senate district in Pennsylvania. So we have 50 senators, that's 150 citizen delegates. Elected legislators, judges, congressmen, state officials cannot run. So it's truly local folks that are running. They would serve for 5 months in the state house chamber, are not paid. They would get their expenses covered. The state would pick up all the costs and pick up, they would provide the expertise, legal services, things like that for the delegates that come down. And then they would, so we pass this bill like we pass every other bill. It's not a constitutional amendment where it goes through the process a couple of sessions. This is just like every other bill, passed in the House and the Senate, signed by the governor, and then it goes to the ballot box. So we pass it, goes to the ballot box, the voters decide whether they want to have it or not. They decide they want to have it, then the delegates run, and they have to circulate petitions, get signatures, do all those things just like everybody else does that runs for office, except there's no party affiliation with any of that. They run without party designation, and any registered voter can sign a petition. They get on the ballot, they run. Once they're elected, then the convention's held, and they set up their own rules, they elect their own officers, and they probably break down, historically they break down in committees and operate much like the legislature does. They have subpoena power, a lot of power to get things done. They come up with their proposals for constitutional changes. And then those changes, at the conclusion of at the convention, those changes then go on the ballot for citizens again to look at and vote on individually. So if, let's say, they have 12 changes they're proposing, the citizens may choose to, by majority vote, pick 5 of those or 8 of those or whatever. So everything comes back to the citizens to make decisions on what they want as far as the changes. I think it's a very safe process. And like Representative Bloom said, we will not get into, we have very strict rules on how it works. People cannot introduce anything to take away guns or any other personal liberty that we have guaranteed on our Constitution today. That cannot happen in this
So while the amendment or the convention process that we're talking about at the state level is very broad, very holistic, the Article 5 convention that the Convention of the States is working on is actually very narrowly tailored. Steve, could you talk a little bit about the legislation that's in Pennsylvania and what it's focused on?
Well, the Convention of States application for an Article 5 convention includes 3 topics. This would do term limits at the federal level on Congress, other elected officials. That would include the judiciary. The second would be any form of fiscal restraints on the federal government. Then the third category is kind of a broad catch-all, which is reductions in the scope and jurisdiction of the federal government. So at the convention that would be called at the federal level, any amendment that fits inside that box would be considered to be germane under the application and could be discussed and then perhaps voted on and proposed in convention. The way the process works at the state level in terms of getting the convention called, excuse me, is every state would need to take action by their state legislature. In the case of Pennsylvania, it's called a concurrent resolution, where both the House and the Senate would pass identical versions of a resolution, and that would serve as the application to Congress. It does not require a signature by the governor. There is no action needed by the governor. This is just an act of the legislature. The resolution itself, in the body of that, there will be certain restrictions on delegate behavior, subject matter restrictions. Even though it may be germane under the application, the legislature can tell the delegation you can or cannot vote on certain topics. You will vote a certain way on certain topics. The legislature is in control of the delegation. Again, 34 states all submit identical applications. Then the convention gets called, and like was mentioned earlier for the state convention, presumably they would break up into committees and deal with different topics based on interest, and it would operate much like a state legislature.
So what prompted you to get involved with this particular project?
Well, interesting, after Obama was reelected, I was surprised that he got reelected, and it was really based on performance. I mean, I realize, there's a lot of partisanship that goes into these things, but I just felt like the numbers weren't there to justify a reelection. I really thought that he would be defeated by Senator Romney, and he wasn't, obviously. And it also occurred to me that we're definitely headed in the wrong direction. So in 2013, as I was mulling over what, if anything, can I do about this, for the sake of my kids, Mark Levin wrote a book called The Liberty Amendments. And that book came out right about the same time a small group of folks were talking about organizing what is now called the Convention of States Project. I simply went online in early 2014 and did a Google or some search engine search around, Article 5 process in Pennsylvania, and up pops Convention of States. And so I raised my hand and started out as a district captain. Later in 2014, I stepped up to the state director role, and I've been in a state leadership role as state director or legislative liaison ever since then. So it's cost me a lot of time and money, but it's definitely worth it. You guys are, if you haven't already paid your taxes, you will next week. And for me anyway, the federal bill that I'm going to write, or federal check I'm going to write, is a lot bigger than the state one. So we obviously need reform, major reform, both in Harrisburg and in Washington, D.C. And for me, I want to make sure we tackle the big check I have to write as well.
So jumping back a little bit here into the state, I'm kind of curious, Senator Eichelberger, you have been at this, working for reforms in Harrisburg for quite a while. What kind of prompted you? Why did you decide that this would be the approach to take?
Well, again, I mean, it's very difficult to get reforms through, and we all know that. When we work on things, and we do get some through. I mean, there's things that happen, there's good things that happen, but it's just, it's unpredictable, and there's not enough good things happening to really make a significant change. So with this comprehensive approach to people opening up the structure and the operations of the three branches of government, we can see significant, massive changes, sweeping changes happen with the operation structure of three branches of government. I mean, that says it all. We can get a lot of good things done in a 5-month period, and the citizens will approve it. I mean, I'm sure that they would be glad to see us tighten up a lot of things that we do, reduce a lot of costs. It's 50 years. Think how technology has changed in advance in a 50-year period. We're not taking advantage of a lot of those things today. There's a lot of efficiencies we could gain by this with circumstances are different. The courts have interpreted things differently over time. All those things need to be accounted for by that citizen delegation. And historically, Pennsylvania's had many of these constitutional conventions over the years. We've had them regularly. Like I said, in that 80-some-year period where we went before without having a convention, 6 times the voters were asked to have a convention if they wanted to. This is unheard of for us to go for a 50-year period and not ask the citizens if they want to see a citizen delegation get together and make some changes to the Constitution. So, and the last Constitutional Convention produced a lot of things that we changed in our court system. 2-term governors now instead of 1. Interestingly, years ago in the 1800s, they grew the size of the legislature because there were people then that had too much control, too much power over the people in the legislature. So the thinking of the time was, if more of rural Pennsylvania had better representation, the power brokers couldn't get to all of them and keep their thumbs on them, and we would have more of a citizen-driven agenda instead of some of the power brokers doing it. Now we see that we probably want to reduce, but that's why we have the provisions in our Constitution to go back, look at things, make them reflective of the time that we're in today. So we should be periodically doing that.
Do we have any questions? Were there any kind of coming around? Okay. While the questions are making their way up there, I think that, you know, our legislators have amply answered the question of whether or not they think the legislature is capable of reforming itself. I guess, Steve, and this probably is a silly question, but do you think Washington, D.C. is capable of reforming itself?
Absolutely not. They demonstrated it most recently with the omnibus bill. And frankly, you know, they are one of our biggest advocates in terms of the negative things that come out of D.C. It's infuriating. And as more and more citizens, you know, wake up and realize that in addition to being infuriating, we have the power ourselves through our elected representatives here in the state to do something about it. And as I've told people, there is not a single piece of the Constitution, there's not a single law, regulation, executive order, Supreme Court decision, nothing that a collective will of 38 state legislatures can't change. And again, I think once a large majority, a large percentage of the citizenry wakes up to this fact, there can and will be significant changes. As Frank mentioned, I hope we can get that done before it's too late. I hope we can do it at a time of our choosing, in a manner of our choosing, and not have some sort of fiscal crisis thrust upon us at the national level that creates enough chaos and dislocation that the process becomes very, very painful. It's going to be painful either way, but better do it now than do it to our kids later.
Thank you. So this is a very practical question that I probably should have answered straight off the top. What is the House bill number?
House Bill 1967.
Senate bill number?
867.
So that's House Bill 1967 and Senate Bill 867. And then for the resolution?
It's the Senate Bill 133, oh boy, and House Bill 187, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, 187.
So those are just some kind of practical stuff. So what amendment, so we had briefly addressed the change to the size of the legislature, that the amendment that had the proposed amendment that got amended. What was changed in the amendment?
The original bill would have reduced the number of legislators in the House from 203 down to 153 and left the Senate intact. That's what passed last legislative session and would have had to pass again exactly in the same form this legislative session. The amendment that they put in changed the number of senators as well, reduced the number of senators, which was the poison pill that blows up the bill and creates a situation where we have to start from scratch.
And Senator Eichelberger, do you think that the Senate, and I know I'm putting you on the spot, but do you think the Senate will vote to reduce its number?
Well, the question is whether we're going to pass the bill or leave it sit or amend it. We can take that amendment out and send it back to the House. And then that puts the House on the hot seat to see if they'll vote for that.
Right.
That bill,
That's the
again,
one opportunity
preserve-
that we still have that can happen, yeah.
And I think the chances are good that we'll do that. I think we'll amend it and send it back. But I'm not sure of that, but I hear a lot of conversation about it.
Okay. So this is more directed to the Article 5 convention. What are some of the problems that the Article 5 convention could address?
Obviously, term limits on the judiciary is something that should be seriously looked at. As you guys know, federal judges are appointed for life. And while that was obviously in the original Constitution, I know the framers did not envision people serving on the federal bench for decade upon decade. It's something that should be discussed in convention. Fiscal restraints, you hear a lot of talk about a balanced budget amendment. I think really what's needed is some form of spending limit, not just balancing the budget, but let's do something dramatic about reducing spending and or providing some sort of state oversight, state legislature oversight of that. But the two things I think that need to be talked about the most seriously are clarifications to the General Welfare Clause and the Commerce Clause. Most of the unconstitutional stuff that the federal government does and most of the spending happens because of judicial misinterpretations or judicial amendments around those two clauses. Clearly, after 230 years, the original intent, while we know what it is, it does get debated, and judges have said, no, this is what it really means now in 2018. Those are huge problems that we're having to deal with the federal government. Those are the things that are driving us to bankruptcy. I think repealing the 16th Amendment, which is federal income tax, individual income tax, we should do that. I think also repealing the 17th Amendment, whereby the direct election of U.S. senators, we stop doing that and send it back to the General Assembly where it belongs, and they pick the two guys or ladies, and they represent the people they pay attention to are these folks, and not special interest groups out amongst the Commonwealth. These guys tell me they never see our U.S. senators. It shouldn't be that way. Our U.S. senators should care a lot about what they think, and right now they don't. So those are examples. There's a lot of other things that could be talked about and dealt with within that germane box, but those are probably 3 or 4 that would be on my list.
Okay. So this is a question about reducing the cost of the state legislature. Instead of reducing the size of the legislature, why don't we reduce the pension benefits and make it a part-time job? Is that something?
These are the kinds of discussions we need to have. I've co-sponsored a bill to reduce the pay from Representative Paul Schemmel, to reduce our pay to $25,000. And I think I'm speaking for everybody up here. Like, I don't take a pension. I don't take the health care. I don't take per diem. But, I live within an area where I wouldn't qualify for per diem anyway. But so that's kind of a moot point. But this is an expensive situation for the citizens of the Commonwealth. But I'm going to tell you, it's not your cost driver. What your cost driver is when you can have a governor who spends $1.4 billion more than the money that has come in, and there are no fiscal restraints that stop him. That's why you need a convention. How does that kind of stuff happen? Our revenue this year will be $35 billion, and miraculously, the spending will equal that. There's not any amount of money you can send to Harrisburg that they won't find a way to spend. And we've got to be careful about this, and we've got to have those restraints. And it's very similar to what Steve said, is that we need to make sure that we've got the fiscal restraints in place. Senator Eichelberger and Senator Fulmer in the Senate was tremendously helpful when one of the bills I had done to get the Auditor General's audit recommendations enforced. When my bill ran into a roadblock, they took the language out and put in another bill, and I want to thank you for that. In the first year, that was $812 million. And somebody said that's low-hanging fruit. I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, if you think $812 million is low-hanging fruit, I don't know about you, I'd like to eat a lot more from that tree. But this is a dangerous thing, and we need to fix this system when that kind of money is around, and that can be done. So a constitutional convention will give us the ability to do that.
Delegates did not follow their charter, and they, in effect, threw it away and ran off the reservation, ran away, the runaway convention, and even though we lucked out and got a great outcome, we don't want to ever take that chance again. That is not a factual version of what happened in Philadelphia in 1787. And so a lot of the resistance that we're getting at the national level in every state, it's not just Pennsylvania, is this runaway convention fear that comes from folks either legitimately fearing it or for whatever reason they prefer some other approach or they can raise money off of it. Tom Coburn can talk extensively about that. But here in Pennsylvania, it's this one organization really that has given us the most headwind. And what it's going to take, again, is more involvement than they can muster to get it done.
Okay. So just to kind of recap on the federal level for the Second Amendment, is the Second Amendment something that is included in the application to the federal?
The resolution that we have here for Pennsylvania has a specific exclusion language in there relative to the Bill of Rights. When we send our delegation, now it's subject to final vote obviously by the General Assembly, but the way it's drafted right now is our delegation would be prohibited from voting on any measure related to the Bill of Rights. Is the Bill of Rights germane under the application? Well, if it has to do with reducing federal power and scope, then it could be. It very well could be. In the case of the Second Amendment, I would say the only way that that would be germane was if we want to strengthen it, make it even more stronger than it is right now. I'm not recommending that. I'm not advocating for that, but it is something that in theory could happen in a convention. But again, the delegations will be restricted. There'll be recall provisions in the resolution. If we have a delegate that goes off the reservation, these guys can recall them. They'll have alternate delegates will be on standby if we get into that kind of a situation. I do think it's reasonable to expect that if we have 34 states pass applications for an Article 5 convention and there's 16 that do not, it's probably reasonable to expect that there will be delegates from some or all of those 16 states that are there to disrupt the convention and to try to do things that would not be germane in an effort to throw it off track. So, shenanigans at the convention potentially, but again, there's be rules of order, and I think the vast majority of the delegates will behave in an honorable fashion.
So then, and how many states would have to approve the amendments made, or the proposed amendments made by the convention?
So it would be 3/4 of the states, 38 states, and that's the case whether the amendments are proposed in convention or if they're proposed by Congress. So all 27 amendments we have, they originated in Congress, and ultimately 3/4 or however many states we had at that point in time would have had to have ratified them to make them part of the Constitution. So obviously something like an abortion amendment or even a weakening of the Second Amendment, you have to believe that there's not 13 states, or at least one chamber in 13 states that would not vote, wouldn't vote for that in order to kill it. So it's a very, very difficult hurdle. It's a very high bar. It was set up that way deliberately. And again, only things that have very, very broad popular support are going to survive it.
And then just in Pennsylvania, could you talk a little bit, have you experienced any major opposition to what you're proposing, or?
Not really. I understand that FOAC doesn't like it. And we've talked about that and met with them, but they have a position, and we understand that. Now, my understanding is the NRA does not have that same position. So not all gun groups feel that there's a threat there to the Second Amendment. But other than that, I'm not aware of any other organized opposition.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've known Kim Stauffer at FOAC for most of my adult life. Kim and I were in the Marine Corps together, and he's an unbelievable patriot. He and I have both had an opportunity in our Marine Corps careers, as I know many of the other veterans here, where nations abuse those powers. I would tell you that I was a reluctant participant until I had a chance to get my concerns 100%. It's unequivocal that the Bill of Rights is not open for discussion with me. Right. And I became completely convinced in this process. So I look forward to sitting down with Kim and FOAC and discussing this with them, because when you swear an oath of allegiance to the United States, it's to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And when I got a concealed carry permit and they gave me a list of the laws in Pennsylvania already, and I compared that to the Second Amendment, something just didn't jive. So I would tell you, protecting the Second Amendment, protecting the Bill of Rights was absolutely critical to me. And I look forward to sitting down and talking with Kim. But I've not gotten any opposition at all to that, other than the discussion that I'll be having with Kim.
Excellent. We have a couple minutes left. Do any of you have any final comments, anything you want to get out? Because I have a couple more questions, but I want to make sure. Okay, so this will be a frank question. What is driving us to bankruptcy?
It's a 1947, no, just kidding. I thought that was funny, in 1947-40. No, well, an unwillingness to deal with the reality of the money that's coming in. The number of people in Harrisburg that don't think you're struggling financially is mind-boggling. I think this election in 2016 was proof positive that the pollsters missed every bit of it, because when I went door to door, I could see the anger in people. And I knew the anger. It's one of the reasons I ran. I ran for the first time in 2016. So what's driving it to us is the unfunded pension liability. The ability to account for cost. And I hate to make an accounting comment, but in business, when you buy an asset, you look at the downstream costs. We do budgeting 1 year in advance. So I could kick stuff under the rug, defer it, pay it based upon a cash basis rather than account for it the way I would do in industry. And as a result of that, we can lie to you. And there are 4 different ways to account for numbers in the Commonwealth. So let me give you an example. We had about $12 billion in special funds, which a group that I was part of, and a number of the representatives here were part of this, identified about $2 billion that could be used. We asked to transfer $1.2 billion, and by the time it was all said and done, we got a token $300 million out of the $12 billion. Special funds set aside somewhere else. Yet at the time the tax code bill and the fiscal code bill came through, miraculously $700 million appeared in a budget that didn't have that kind of limit. So it's a lack of financial controls. It's the same type of thing that Steve mentioned about the federal government, that you can put all this pork in when you have a city of the 3rd class and a county of the 2nd class bordering a county of the 5th class, and nobody knows who that is, but it's only one school district. There's something wrong with that system. And so the other aspect is infrastructure. In business or in a home, when you buy a home or build a home, you know you're going to have to maintain it. We know that in government too, but we don't account for it that way. So we wait until it starts to get ready to collapse. $200 billion of deferred infrastructure repairs need to be done. So it's this ability to pass a budget annually and not look at the long-term strategic financial structure. We should have a rainy day fund that's mandated by the legislature that gets used for rainy day purposes. We should stop viewing your home as a checkbook of unlimited means. Mark my words, the Independent Fiscal Office said it very clearly, we're losing young people in the Commonwealth in record numbers, and we're getting elderly people. I'm a senior citizen. This is a great place to retire. Young people don't share our same value of being in the Commonwealth. So it's that entire infrastructure, and it's why I absolutely believe this will only be fixed by the great leadership of Senator Eichelberger and Representative Bloom and the 2 brilliant bills that they put together that I had nothing to do with other than being a co-sponsor and someone who believes in entirely.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody, for your attention.
Well, you did a great job.
And thanks very much to our panelists. Thanks.
Good. Great job, sir.
Don't go anywhere. There's lots of exciting stuff coming up.
Dr. Tom A. Coburn was raised